Oh, wait, there it is. Hello? Hello? Can you hear it? Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, that sounds great. Because it doesn't matter for them if it was. I guess they'll have to just make the slides be a little bit.
Mami, ¿qué pasa si te cara la migra?
Porque
Check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2. That's me, sorry. Here, just watch out really quick. I can check 1 2, check 1 2. Check 1 2, check 1 2. Yeah, if you just use this, and if you talk down here, you won't be able to hear it very well, but if you speak into it just like that.
hello? Hey, hello? Okay. Is this sound okay? That's
Sounds better than
Yeah, you're a little louder than I am. Does that sound okay? I think that sounds better than the last one. What do you think? Is that good? Okay, so I'm just going to use the microphone.
Okay. I'll take that other one from you.
Okay.
Which is right there.
Right there.
Okay.
Okay, I can turn it off till we need it, or will it stay on?
Okay, and so you want it to be squared and even.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Hello. It really does feel like karaoke. I'll break out into song. This might be the more comfortable way to do it. I'm trying to decide whether I want this on my right or this on my right.
Well, do you want to shoot it straight or do you want to shoot it on an angle? Because where you're at here is an angle.
No, this is however you can get it square. But it needs to be.
I'm going to move it straight back. I'm going to move these tables.
Don't walk that way.
Don't worry, we're going to move this table.
I'm just going to move right over here.
I got it. Don't worry about it. I'll move the chairs and stuff. Okay.
It looked like your videos were looking fine.
Yeah.
That's what you always worry about, right?
Yes. It looks like this. Oh no, I was going to say it looks like this is going to finally stop, but it didn't. It's just lagging. There we go. Great.
It's pretty close.
Yeah.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to have them bring some tape in here. All right. So now, all right. Did the sound work
Yes.
on the stream?
Yep.
Cool. You're good
Yep,
with
the
sound
videos
here?
worked. It all worked. Yep.
Sound from the laptop, we tested the videos, that works too. I'm gonna have them come in here and clean this up, and I'm gonna make sure that the table, they might have to move the tables back a little bit and rearrange the tables in here, but other than that, we should be all set.
Okay. Well, it starts in like 5 minutes.
It does?
Yeah.
All right.
Supposed to, so people should be coming in the next few minutes or so.
All right.
I'm just gonna put our stuff back in.
Yeah, I just put, yeah.
Oh, no.
Thank you. Oh, I need a,
Oh, sure. It's there, yeah.
we did, we have, and Susan, we have the parking
Oh, yeah,
pass.
okay. I didn't go on the phone.
Andy, I'm charging my car right now. Every time I come to the car, someone's always taking the charging station, so now my car's being charged. I'll have to get gas.
I don't think they need to really see this. Let's see here. Now
What do you think? I can put a few, oh, you know what we need? We need, sign. I didn't even think about it.
I was like, I don't think I have a tiny, a little paper.
You could put, no, don't you worry. You could put you wanna put a put start on your,
On my phone?
no, get it to your first slide, your.
Oh, no, but I think she has another slide.
Oh,
She
that's
has
right.
she has another, did you want to put the other slide out that you wanted to put
Oh,
up?
sure. Yeah.
I didn't bring my, I may have some pen. Good, thanks for coming. breezy. It was slushy. So when we got out of the site, it was slushy. So we missed Ignacio. So he's gonna, well, we misunderstood each other. He thought I was talking about tomorrow. And I thought he was talking about today. I was talking about today. So he was on his way to Flint. You're gonna have lunch tomorrow.
investigate the impact of culturally relevant factors on the adjustment of minoritized youth and their families. And her work has been funded by multiple departments at NIH, and she's currently the vice president of programming for the Society of Research on Adolescents, and also an associate editor for the Journal of Research on Adolescents. Clinically, she specializes in the provision of therapeutic services to Latinx families and provides training to providers working with the Latinx community. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Stein.
Thank you. It's going to be a little complicated with the microphone and my clickers, but hopefully it'll work. So thank you so much for coming out in the snow. I know that it's a treacherous day, and I appreciate the invitation. It's quite an honor to come here. I've been following the work of a lot of scholars here for a long time, and I'm honored just to be here and engage in these conversations with you. So I'm going to take you through some of the research that I've been doing recently on discrimination and the impact primarily focused on the Latinx community. And given that we're a smaller group, feel free to just interrupt me and ask questions. I'm actually perfectly happy to make this more conversational. So feel free. I know I talk very fast, and I guess I should come and be in front of this for a second since we are podcasting it. So I know I talk very fast, so feel free to interrupt and ask any questions along the way. So I want to start by talking a little bit about a research study that we just published in the Journal of Youth and Adolescence that focused on sort of the longitudinal impact of discrimination symptoms or discrimination on anxiety and depressive symptoms in Mexican origin youth. So this was a collaborative effort, and all the work that I enjoy doing science with folks. So these are my set of co-authors, including some students and postdocs, as well as just collaborators. So we know from the literature that it's pretty well established that racial ethnic discrimination predicts greater symptoms of both depression and anxiety. And some of this work has longitudinally assessed this relationship. So for a long time, sort of the question was, what comes first, right? If you're depressed and anxious, do you just perceive more discrimination? But in fact, the research has been pretty clear in saying that's not necessarily the case. So some initial work looked at sort of particularly, these are different grades in school at the top. You can see that Katie Zeters and Siren did some work that looked at baseline discrimination symptoms. So if you reported more discrimination at these points in high school, that was associated with more internalizing symptoms at the time. We also see some longitudinal associations in which you find usually the relationship is if you're perceiving more discrimination, you show less decreased slopes in depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms. So typically we see grand mean sort of decrease in slopes of symptomatology, but peer discrimination in particular sort of attenuates that decline. But what, as you can tell from this research that has been done here, is we have nothing that goes across the entire swath of from 5th grade to 12th grade. And also one question that I really was interested in is, are there particular timing effects that might be important for us to think about? So Diane Hughes has also had this question in mind. And so she was the only other person, her and her team, to look at this question. And they did a piecemeal approach to discrimination in their sample. So they were able to look at middle school and high school separately. So they basically ran two different types of longitudinal models where they were able to find increases in peer and adult discrimination in middle school, but then decreases in high school aged kids. And then they did find some differential associations with the increases predicting concurrent symptoms in middle school, and the greater decreases in peer discrimination were associated with less symptoms over time. So it was sort of protective if you had less discrimination. So this really was the only study that had really considered across these two different time frames how did discrimination impact symptomatology. But one of the things that I was really interested in is, does it matter when you experience these increases in discrimination? Is there any individual level effects that might happen if you yourself report more discrimination, particularly at transition to new school settings? So I don't have to convince a group of developmentalists that transitions to new school settings are important to think about. We know that these transition points, particularly in early, from elementary to middle school, there's a mismatch between the emotional needs of kids and sort of this new context that's sort of hard to navigate. We also know that these transitions are associated with cognitive and identity shifts. So it would be really important to think about as kids transition to middle school and in high school, they're sort of negotiating, who am I in these contexts? What am I doing in these contexts? Sorry, I'm standing in front of the thing. Where am I in these contexts? So that's an important piece as well. And we also know, even in this era of hypersegregation, that these transitions are also associated with changes in demographics. So you're more likely to go from a least diverse school to a more diverse school when you transition, because you're going from less sort of more neighborhood-based schools to schools that sort of draw from a larger population. So this really led the question for us to think about, well, does it matter when you experience an increase in discrimination? And are these tied to these transition points? So do increases in discrimination at the transition to middle school and at the transition to high school actually predict more symptomatology later on? So that's what I just said. So that's what we were interested in studying. Here, Laura Castro-Shiloh, who's the second author on this paper, is a statistician on the project, and she had sort of used a latent change score model that would be able to actually look at variation at each time point to predict subsequent outcomes. So we could test, do changes between 6th and 7th grade versus 7th to 8th grade versus 8th to 9th grade subsequently predict more symptoms later on? So are there timing effects? From a life course perspective, we would suspect that there may be timing effects, right? There might be something unique about experiencing more discrimination at certain points that may impact sort of how you then negotiate that space for kids. So we used the California Families Project research to answer this question. This is a large data set that was collected out in California, hence its name. It had 667 Mexican origin youth. We had 85% of mothers and 89% of fathers were first generation, which meant that most of the kids were growing up in immigrant families. You can see sort of that there were low-income households with 63% of mothers and 65% of fathers having less than high school education, and the median income was between $30,000 and $35,000. So they did home interviews. We have 3-item measure of global peer discrimination that we had at each time point, and then they had self-reported symptoms of general anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder at each time point, and they collected data every year between 5th and 12th grades. Okay. So what did we find? Well, first we sort of looked at what are the changes in discrimination over time in this piecemeal approach. And here's the transition points that I put in red. So what we found is that some relative stability in middle school. So unlike the study that Diane Hughes had done, which had shown increases in middle school, we actually didn't find that in our context. But we did see increases in discrimination right at the transition to 9th grade. But as you can see by that darker line, it goes up and down, up and down. So that it didn't look exactly like the work that had been published by Hughes and all. But what we did find was longitudinal baseline effects. So for kids who reported greater discrimination from their peers, and these were just 3 items, which I always think when I really think about this. This was kids make jokes about Mexican origin youth, like you don't feel accepted in your school. These 3 items predicted more, both depression and anxiety symptoms by 12th grade, controlling for symptoms when they started. So if you really think about this, that how you experience discrimination when you're 10 is impacting your symptoms when you're 18. And I really think that longitudinal effect had not, is really, really highlights the pernicious effects of discrimination and how these experiences likely build upon each other over time. But what about the timing effects that I was interested in testing? We didn't find any timing effects for depression, but we did find timing effects for anxiety symptoms. But they were off kilter. So they were not right at the transition point, but the year after. So both after the year of transition to middle school, and they transitioned to middle school in 6th grade, at 7th grade in California, or in this part of California. And after the transition, so from 9th to 10th grade, is when we saw those kids experienced greater anxiety symptoms by the end of high school. So there were some impacts around anxiety that were happening that are important to consider. So one of the things that we really were surprised by were the differential kinds of effects from the middle school and high school findings relative to what had been found before. And one thing I realized is the majority of the research that has examined this question has been in New York City, which is a very unique cultural context. While the work that we've sort of has shown some differential effects have been in California. So the research that April Benner has done, some of that work out in California has also shown some increases in high school, which is not what's been found in New York. So I think that really highlights some contextual effects that we really need to start thinking about, population level effects that we need to start thinking about, and really thinking through what the different populations in terms of the context, in terms of their experiences of discrimination. As I said, these longitudinal effects were one of the few studies that have established it for such a long period of time from those 5th grade level symptoms. And then one of the things that we were interested in this post-transition, so that it wasn't that immediate first sort of report of discrimination right when you transition, but the year after. And we really feel like maybe that happens because kids are trying to get the lay of the land or starting to get more experiences with their peers or with sort of their context. And as they're getting that experience in their context, then they then sort of are internalizing or understanding these symptoms. And the reason why anxiety we think is important is there's a lot of models of discrimination effects that really focus on race-related anxiety, sort of race-related sort of perceiving that that discrimination is going to happen, and race rejection kinds of anticipating it. So we think that the anticipatory anxiety is likely playing a role in sort of feeling like I'm getting discriminated against. How am I interacting with my peers? I don't know exactly how to do this. I'm not sure what's happening in this context. So we think that that's why we are seeing some of these anxiety effects. We also know that sort of, for example, social anxiety can really, it hasn't been examined as much as an outcome with discrimination in kids in elementary school and middle schools and high school. So I think this is really points to more work should really isolate these different effects by anxiety and depression, because most of the research couples internalizing symptoms together using something like the YSR or something like that. So I think uncoupling depression and anxiety is going to be really important as we think about that these may have different kinds of developmental impacts. So this RUN study really established there are some timing effects. So when discrimination hurts, that can happen across adolescence. But what do we know can protect youth when they experience discrimination? So I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper with my graduate student, was the first author on this, and this is work that we've been doing in the lab. And this is our first paper that came out looking at a shift and persist perspective. Are you familiar, people with this concept? Okay, so I can tell you a little bit about it. Here's just a large set of collaborators that are working on this project as well, folks I've worked with for a while. So Chen and Miller proposed shift and persist as a constellation of coping resources that are going to help youth who are experiencing uncontrollable stressors. And this sort of idea is that you have to both be able to cognitively shift away, so distract, so these secondary coping mechanisms that had been, for the most part, conceptualized as not useful because they're sort of distraction kinds of techniques. You're not actively engaging in the stressor, you're not problem solving, you're not sort of engaging in that stress, so that those secondary coping mechanisms might be really critical for kids who experience uncontrollable stressors. So if you don't have control over those stressors, it's going to be difficult it's better to distract and to then, what they also argue, cognitively reappraise. So gain something from the experience, sort of reinterpret, grow from the experience, that those cognitive coping skills that are typically considered not useful are really important, but only in conjunction with meaning, searching for purpose and meaning, and optimism. So the persist part of shift and persist is the ability to sort of look forward to the future, find meaning in other aspects of your lives and identity, have some optimism that things will work out. So you're able to shift away from the stressor and then sort of engage in something more positive in your world, in your environment. So shift and persist they sort of proposed this about 5 or 10 years ago. And they've done a good series of work showing that indeed shift and persist is protective, primarily looking at different health outcomes, and primarily for kids experiencing socioeconomic stress. So kids, and then some of this has been with adults as well, who endorse this constellation of cognitive coping and persisting mechanisms then show lower inflammation, better diurnal cortisol, lower BMIs, reduction in asthma symptoms, lower allostatic load. So they've really found that this sort of set of coping resources actually does attenuate the stress response system in such a way to promote some more positive health outcomes in youth. But really, a majority of the work has been focused on economic stress. There was one study done by Lamb et al. That looked at unfair treatment, but they didn't really describe it as discrimination. It was just unfair treatment, and it was a very diverse sample. So another uncontrollable stressor that kids experience, particularly kids of color, is discrimination, right? They don't have control over that. It's a similar type of stressor. So what would shift and persist work in the context of peer discrimination? Is this something that would help kids sort of do better when they face this type of uncontrollable stressor? Was still an open question. And then if you look at the literature on what protects kids against discrimination, the majority of the literature focuses on ethnic racial identity as a promotive factor. And some recent meta-analytical work that Yijie was a part of really showed that indeed it does buffer the effects of discrimination, but it depends on the outcome and it depends on the type of identity that we look at. So one of the things we were really interested in is understanding to shift and persist couple with ethnic racial identity to protect against mental health outcomes, because we know ethnic identity, primarily private regard and centrality, so the ideas of how you perceive yourself as part of your racial ethnic group. Do you feel connected to your racial ethnic group? Are you proud to be a part of that group? That those have not uniformly protected against depressive symptomatology. So one of the ideas that I've been thinking about for a really long time is you need identity plus. And my idea was, do you need identity plus shift and persist? This type of coping mechanisms and resources to sort of attenuate the effects of discrimination. So does shift and persist protection extend to depressive symptoms was our first question. We were the first, even though Chen and Miller argue that it's both physiological and psychological, the protective effects, they actually did not, no one had tested that prior to this paper. And does it work differentially? Do shift and persist and ethnic racial identity processes work differentially depending on the type of stressor? So we hypothesized that shift and persist would be sufficient for economic stress, but that it would only be protective when coupled with ethnic racial identity. Yeah? Okay. So this was tested in our sample that we have in North Carolina. It was a cross-sectional sample of 7th and 8th grade kids. We had, again, primarily kids in immigrant families. The majority of youth were U.S. born, and those who weren't U.S. born had parents that or were immigrated before the age of 5. So they were similar to U.S. born kids in many ways. You can see that they were fairly low SES with a median household income of $25,000 a year. And we did home interviews where we collected data on peer discrimination. We used the MIBI, so for private regard and centrality, which is sort of the MFQ for moods and feeling questionnaire for depressive symptoms. I'm happy to talk more about the questionnaires if people have questions at the end. So the shift and persist work have really focused on just bringing items from coping measures and then from sort of purpose and meaning or optimism measures to put together this measure of shift and persist, which is basically what we did. So we had some of these distraction measures that you see or some positive reinterpretation. So I look for something good in what was happening. I accept the reality of what happened. I learned to live with it. Right? So these aren't primary coping skills. These aren't, I changed the problem. These are, I just learned to either deal with it or I sort of thought about it in a different way. And then we had the persist, the sense of meaning and purpose in your life, right? So those are the items that we had from a meaning and purpose questionnaire. And these operated as a construct together. So what did we find? So as we hypothesized, shift and persist did help attenuate the experience of economic hardship on depressive symptoms. So as you can see from the red line, it's still significant, but it's significantly different from the blue line. So kids that had lower levels of shift and persist, who experienced more economic hardship, were more likely to endorse depressive symptomatology relative to kids who are higher in shift and persist. So shift and persist operated exactly how Chen and Miller hypothesized in this sample of Latinx youth, and it was not moderated by ethnic racial identity. So it worked the same regardless of your level of private regard and centrality. But the story was different for discrimination. So what we found for discrimination, in fact, was not what we anticipated. So as you can see, for all kids who had high racial ethnic identity, so with higher private regard and centrality, the more discrimination they experience, the more depressive symptomatology they feel, which is really consistent with the literature. And shift and persist did nothing to help them. So it was not useful. But it was useful for kids who had low levels of ethnic and racial identity. So if kids did not feel sort of a sense of connection to their group, or did not feel that being Latinx was central to their identity, and they experienced the discrimination, as that went up, if they were higher on shift and persist, they did not experience any more depressive symptomatology. While if you can see, those kids with low levels of ethnic racial identity and low levels of shift and persist did have symptomatology. So shift and persist was useful if that stressor that they perceived was not, with the discrimination stressor maybe didn't speak to them in terms of, it wasn't central to their identity. So what we found in this was that shift and persist reduced the risk for a non-racialized stressor, or in combination with low levels of ethnic racial identity, low levels for facing discrimination. So this is extending some of the work that was done by Chen and Miller. However, we were really confused, or not confused, but just like, wow, I really believed that this was going to be, that those coping mechanisms would be helpful for kids coupled with ethnic racial identity. So one question is, well, is it because we didn't have optimism, right? Maybe optimism was more important than a sense of meaning or purpose. Particularly if you're looking at depression with a lot of hopelessness and sort of negative ideas about the future. So that was one of the things that we were thinking about. We also think it might be important, just like I argued that maybe this would look different for other outcomes, mental health outcomes or self-esteem or some other outcomes. So I think a lot more work needs to focus on sort of shift and persist and how it might operate. I will say that we're finalizing a paper on the California Families Project, in which we found the exact same results with depressive symptomatology across time and with an optimism measure. So again, shift and persist was not protective in the context of ethnic racial identity, and in fact, only with low levels of ethnic racial identity was shift and persist protective, but it was protective for economic stress. So we've seen it in another sample as well, which I think just really begs the question, what needs to be coupled with sort of ethnic racial identity to protect against some of these mental health outcomes. And one thing that we're really interested in extending some of the shift and persist work is, does it matter on what type of persist? So we're looking into civic engagement potentially as a way to sort of create that meaning and that hope in kids. We're also considering religious coping and sort of religious, because that also provides a sense of meaning and purpose for kids, particularly for kids of color. So we're really trying to think about, does persist matter? And does shift and persist matter in terms of discrimination in a different kind of way? And do we want to conceptualize this idea differently for kids of color in facing discrimination? So I've sort of summarized a couple of our studies on discrimination that we've done, and I think it's sort of, when we think about discrimination right now, both of these studies were collected prior to the current socio-political climate that we're living in for Latinx communities. There was a big shift in 2015 in the experience of discrimination in the Latinx community that was coupled with sort of the Donald Trump's election, which was really came out around the criminalization of immigrant populations, right? So there was a lot of political discourse around immigrants sort of coming in and taking resources, being criminal not only because they crossed the border in an illegal way, as they argue, but also then are bringing crime to this country, as you can see by some of the sort of political discourse that's out there. And kids are being exposed to this rhetoric, and it's at this time sort of the Southern Poverty Center talked about that kids started to report more of this ethnic racial teasing that was really embedded with sort of the election of Donald Trump. Similarly, after the election, our country has been hit with a lot of policy implications of sort of this anti-immigrant rhetoric, including the separation of kids and their families. So this is sort of at the border that we saw as families were escaping, particularly Central America, the poverty and sort of some of the difficulties in those settings. They were then coming to the border and being separated. And one thing that's really important, clearly these families are suffering significantly at these separations. These kids are being ripped apart from their parents, and their suffering is it's just, unimaginable in many ways. Yet these same sort of images are impacting all of the Latinx population here in the United States. So I think that's the other important piece to think about. In addition to the separations at the border, there are significant separations that are happening now due to the increased deportations that are happening. So the picture here is a little girl in Mississippi after who was left at school, didn't know where to go, didn't know where her parents were when they were deported. So the separations are happening not just at the border, but every day in sort of these states in which there's this increased ICE activity. And I think that you have to think about the context that kids are experiencing the discrimination as Latinx kids now are. It's in this context of sort of this anti-immigrant rhetoric where people have felt emboldened to be able to sort of espouse these beliefs, sort of being able to sort of say, well, this is just political rhetoric. I'm just support our president. That's not something discriminatory to say that. And at the same time, they're being exposed to their community, being attacked in many ways and having faced a lot of sort of challenges. And I was telling last night, Deborah and Desiree at dinner, that this really culminated in, I was, on my family's group chat, my brother shared with me something that was given to his daughter for her 16th birthday by a white friend. He put that in her birthday card. And I think it really encapsulates how the fear that sort of this weaponization of the political process as a way to discriminate more against kids and families. And this is sort of the experience of these families that are sort of really feeling this crisis that is in our community right now, that's coupled with sort of the current administration and some of the policies that they're enacting. So what do we know? I really worry about my community significantly right now. I really worry about sort of the negative ramifications that this is having. We know that the Latinx community is not seeking services to the same level, even if they're documented. They're not going to access public health services, they're not going to the doctor, they're not going to go get prenatal care. There's a lot of sociological research that's really highlighting sort of the damaging of the states in which they have more of these kinds of policies, the mental health and well-being of the Latinx population, regardless of their documentation status, is jeopardized. So we know that this dehumanization is impacting all of these communities. A recent paper by Katie Roche found that 300% increases in mental health symptoms of parents who are just exposed to the news about sort of what's happening in these communities. So that's leading to more symptomatology as well. And we also know from work that these worries about deportation are significantly contributing to depressive symptomatology in citizen children. We know that this worry and this fear, living in this constant state of fear, is impacting all of these families. Just at lunch today, someone was sort of telling me that here in Michigan, families were not going to school because they were worried about the risk they were putting themselves into by even just driving to school. And I want to highlight sort of what this is meaning in the real lives of the Latinx community. So I'm going to show a short video from a project that I'm going to talk about after we watch the video, in which we are talking with families about how to talk with their kids about race and ethnicity. And so basically there's just a little girl and their mom, and basically all I said, the prompt is talk to your mom about something about just being Latinx here in North Carolina. Just talk to your mom about something about that. That was the prompt she was given. And so here is oops, I went backward. Not that I wanted to. Okay, let's see if this works.
Mami, ¿qué pasa si te cara la migra?
¿Por qué me preguntas eso?
Quiero saber.
¿Pero por qué tienes esa inquietud de saber qué va a pasar si me agarra la migra?
¿Dónde voy a ir? ¿Quién me va a cuidar?
Pero Sí, yo entiendo esa parte, que tú quieres saber dónde vas a ir y quién te va a cuidar, pero ¿por qué tienes el miedo de que a mí me vaya a agarrar la migra?
Verdaderamente tengo miedo que te van a agarrar y no voy a estar contigo.
¿Pero por qué?
Porque he visto en la televisión, las noticias, los niños están separados de sus papás.
Eso es lo que a ti te preocupa,
Sí.
que nos vayan a separar de nosotros.
Ujú.
Si llegara a suceder que a mí me agarrara la migración, como yo te he dicho, se queda tu papá y tu hermano. Y veríamos la forma de siempre estar juntos, de no separarnos. Si nos tendríamos que ir a vivir a México, sería un cambio muy drástico para ustedes, pero seguiríamos juntos. O sea que eso es algo que no debes de temer. ¿Y qué vas a hacer? Vas a estar con tu hermano siempre. Tienes tíos a los que tú les puedes llamar. Tienes primos que siempre van a estar a tu lado. Y eso tú lo sabes. ¿Te acuerdas? Como aquel día que nos agarró la policía.
Sí.
¿Qué pasó?
Te llevaron tu carro y protecieron nosotros para ver que no le robas otra vez.
Ajá.
Al regreso.
Pero ¿quién fue por nosotros?
Mi prima.
Entonces, ¿ves esa parte? Que siempre tu familia va a estar para ayudarte cuando tú los necesites.
Ajá.
O sea que ese no debería de ser tu miedo. Tú tienes que ir creciendo feliz y no con miedo a que nos van a separar.
Pero ¿qué va a pasar? Que me va a dar comida y que me va a dar agua y que me va a dar mis medicinas.
Tu papá, es muy difícil que nos agarraran a los dos al mismo tiempo. Yo pienso que siempre debería de haber uno, papá o mamá a tu lado. Porque probablemente podrían agarrar a uno, pero no a los dos.
¿Por qué no pueden agarrar a los dos?
Porque nosotros no somos criminales. No hemos cometido infracciones para que nos vengan a detener. Siempre hemos hecho las cosas como el país las lleva. Nuestro único delito es que somos de otro país.
Si van a México, tú y papá, ¿pueden ir con ustedes?
Claro, ustedes pueden ir con nosotros a México cuando nosotros nos vayamos. Y podemos vivir en México todos juntos.
¿Podemos estar con mi abuelita por un poquito rato?
Sí, podríamos ir con tu abuelita.
¿Y cómo nos van a traer si te traen a tú y papi ahí?
No, si nosotros nos vamos todos, ya nos quedamos a vivir allá.
So you can see this little girl, you know, we just asked her to talk about what's it like to be Latinx, and she really highlighted this constant fear that she's living in, and just the question she was asking: who will give me food? Who will give me water? Who will give me medicine? Who's going to go? Like, she really, there was a video that didn't make it. She's like, how do we cross the river? She was very like, just wanting the very facts about how this was going to happen and what this would look like for her family. And so there's really important work in terms of this context of this living in fear, this living in as an undocumented family, how that then impacts conversations about race and ethnicity. Cecilia Yon is doing some really good work on this topic out in California, and then up here in Michigan, Debbie Rivas-Drake and Fernanda Cross are also doing some of this work as well, that's really sort of thinking around how racial ethnic socialization in the Latinx community sort of has some space that it shares with sort of this current climate of that we're living in terms of how they're viewed. I think the other thing that mom talks about is we're not criminals, right? She really was like, we're not. She's countering sort of that narrative that somehow they're here as criminals or breaking the law, and that's what this little girl is worried about. So this sort of highlights some of the work that we're doing. So we know that discrimination is hard. We know that discrimination is impacting kids. We're having a hard time finding what are ways in terms of mental health to protect kids. But one thing that I was really clear on is that families, particularly Latinx families, aren't having these conversations with their kids around the experiences of discrimination, in many parts because they are immigrants, and so they don't necessarily know what to do or how to have these conversations. And so this prompted some of the work that I'm going to talk about now. on sort of racial ethnic socialization in this community. And one of the things that is important is that we know from the larger literature that Latinx families have a lot of cultural socialization conversations. And what cultural socialization basically means is around your pride in your group and traditions from your country, the music that we listen to, the holidays that we celebrate, the food that we eat, right? These are the things that they do really well, but that they don't necessarily have these preparation for bias conversations that we know are important. And also in other groups, typically people wait to have these conversations. Typically people wait till their kids are quote unquote old enough to understand race. They don't want to have this conversation with their kids where they have to say, hey, you may be discriminated against, you may be treated differently. At what age are you supposed to start telling your kids these things? What age is that appropriate? So we know from the literature that for the most part, families wait till middle school around to start having these conversations. But if you go back to that first study that I talked about, that by 5th grade, those experiences of discrimination can impact your trajectories of symptomatology across time, I worry that that time is a little too late and that we need to start having conversations with kids a little bit earlier to really be able to navigate these environments that they're experiencing, particularly now in the current sociopolitical context where it has been sort of becoming more normalized to have these kinds of experiences and conversations. So this is work that we are doing at UNCG with a seed grant that we got from the university with myself, Laura Gonzalez, who's done work in parenting groups, Lisa Kiang, who's done work in East Asian families, and Stephanie Cord, who does work with the African American community and Black families. And at the time, her student was helping us. Dominique Edwards was helping us with this work as well. So what we started out was really doing some focus groups. So we knew a lot from the literature, but we wanted to learn what really makes these conversations hard prior to middle school. So we did some focus groups that were really aimed at understanding the barriers and facilitators of these types of conversations across a lot of different families. So we got 63 families. As you can see, they were spread out in terms of different ethnicities. I had a graduate student, Pooja Patel, who just started working with me, who's really interested in this in the Indian American community, so we did some focus groups with them as well. And basically, we just had some guided questions around what makes these conversations difficult and challenging, how these conversations gone well, when have these conversations not gone well, what makes it, what sort of gets in the way of these conversations, and what kinds of things are you telling your kids? We audio taped and transcribed them, and for those that weren't in Spanish, because some of the Chinese groups were in Mandarin, and then we translated those as well as the ones in Spanish. And we did some inductive thematic analysis that we're still doing so this is hot off the press. We still haven't cleaned everything up, but this is just a preview about some of the things that we're finding in this research. So what we really saw, and I'm going to focus on the Latinx community since that's what I'm here talking about today in some of our findings, but what we saw was that there were a lot of barriers to discussing discrimination, and primarily a lot of them is that these conversations were hard. They were hard for parents, they were hard for kids, and particularly in the context of parents who didn't have the knowledge about how to have those conversations. I remember running a focus group with a mom who said that her kid sort of had these experiences and she was crying. She was like, I don't know what to tell her. I don't know what to say to her to make her feel better. So instead they just didn't really talk about it because they were living in such fear. The other thing that was clear is that for some of the families, how they even perceived discrimination was interesting. So for some of the immigrant families, they talked about, one of the quotes was, well, of course they treat me differently. I'm not from here. So of course I get treated differently. So the parents really understood that this discrimination was something that they maybe signed up for when they came to a new country. But for their kids, that's not how they perceive them at all, because their kids are growing up here as Americans. And it's consistent with some of the work that has shown that discrimination is less impactful for mental health symptoms for immigrants than it is for native-born folks. So there's some evidence of that. So that really serves as a barrier to these conversations because the immigrant parents are sort of saying, well, just ignore it. Don't worry about it. Just turn your eye, and turn your cheek, and you can let this go, was some of the things that we saw. Additionally, some of the kids didn't want to disclose to their parents experiences of discrimination. So they really were trying to protect their parents. They saw their parents as overburdened or overworked or having a lot of other worries. And so they didn't want to have these conversations with their parents because they didn't want them to worry about something else, particularly as it intersected with undocumented status. The other thing we found was some of the parents who had documentation sort of said, we don't have it so bad. So compared to those other families, they really have it bad. So they almost didn't have space to perceive it as discriminatory towards them because they were protecting others in their community that they were felt as most at risk. And so they said, well, compared to them, we don't have it so bad. So we can't, who are we to complain about these experiences? So they really didn't even encode it in that way because they felt that the community that was most at risk was the undocumented folks. And then a lot of parents, and this was across all the different groups, talked about not wanting to put ideas in their kids' heads, not wanting them to sort of perceive discrimination if it necessarily wasn't there, and sort of helping their kids figure this out on their own. So there was a lot of sort of the barriers that we saw. The other thing kids said is like, well, what do I need to talk to my parents for? I can just go to the internet and find the answer. So then they didn't really even see their parents as potential sources of information around this topic. And I think that was particularly true for the immigrant kids that sort of saw it that way. But we did see some facilitators. So did they say, particularly with the Latino community, said that the confianza was really important. Having that relationship and that trust amongst the parents and their kids was really important. Both of them talked about active listening. Both the kids and the parents sort of wanted more engaged conversations. Some of the African American community, the kids was saying, well, my mom just talks at me and she just goes on and on and on and I just tune her out. Eventually I just like, so again, that sort of reciprocal conversation wasn't happening. And then something we saw primarily with the African American community, we talked about modeling how to cope with discrimination as more purposefully, like that's how I'm going to teach them how to cope with it. Not by telling them, but by telling them from my own life experiences what's happening and how I've dealt with it, and that's the way that they'll learn. So these are some of the things that we're still doing. There's a lot of really rich data. We're talking about some of this at lunch today that we've gotten from this. So we're excited to continue to sort of look at this and publish it. But this then served the foundation for an intervention that we're developing or that we've developed called One Talk at a Time. So another video. So let me talk to you at the end of this.
Unfortunately, we live in a society that sees your race or ethnicity first before they get to know you.
Por ejemplo, yo voy manejando, un policía me puede parar solo por mi color, por ser latino. Eso es lo que para mí significa ser latino en este país, miedo.
When you're younger, you really want to fit in. I know when I was a child, even around my daughter's age, I think there were times when I didn't want my friends to come over to my house because I just thought it was just too different.
It's really about preparing them to be independent people, independent thinkers, and to find their voice, which is going to be different from mine and from their mothers, but to not be afraid of that.
I don't feel like I had a lot of conversations with my parents about race and ethnicity until I was much older. I'm motivated because I don't feel like I had enough conversations like that when I was his age or growing up.
Una Plática a la Vez es un programa que hemos desarrollado para fomentar las conversaciones difíciles y a veces valientes que uno tiene que tener con sus hijos.
We hope to empower parents to have these courageous conversations.
By avoiding it and not talking about it, you're talking about it whether you think it or not. It's okay, we all struggle with this, and here's some tools to help you to get through it, and we'll do it together.
So that's the intervention. We sort of based it on some of these barriers that parents had talked about, as well as some of the research on ethnic racial socialization in the community. So basically, it's meant to be consumed right now online, although we are going to develop a community version of it, and I'll tell you why in a second. So we have it online right now, and it sort of has three different components: some psychoeducation, some skill building, and some modeling. And what you see is that there's short little videos that you see, and then you have some sort of questionnaires or questions that you fill out, and then you continue to move on watching videos across with these little sort of breaks with some modeling at the end. So the first set of videos are psychoeducation, and the way that we did this, because we recognize that these are different experiences in these different communities, but at the same time there's some universal barriers to these conversations that we were trying to sort of get at. So we sort of made the videos. We have 11 videos, and the first one and the last one are the same across both groups, but then the middle 9 videos are different for each group, and so it has each of us talking. So the psychoeducation component are just sort of videos from us sort of saying, hey, these are what ethnic racial conversations are. This is why they are important. These are how they can help your kids. And this is why we think this would be important for you to have. And in between those, we have parents identify what goals do they have for their kids? What do they want for their kids? So we really use some concepts from motivational interviewing to sort of build efficacy. Sort of what do they know right now? What kinds of conversations are they having right now? How balanced are these conversations? So we really focus on the balance, that you have to have both cultural socialization and prep for bias conversations, and identifying the specific barriers that they face in having these conversations. Why is it hard for them? The primary barriers that parents have told us thus far are that it's hard to talk about and their kids are too young. So the two that we thought were the ones that, those are the folks that have done this have told us that those are indeed the ones that make it challenging for them. After the psychoeducation component, we have our actual intervention, which is we called Ready, Set, Talk. In Spanish, it's Listos para hablar. And so each component sort of focuses on what parents need to do. So the ready component is really, what do parents need to do to be ready to have these conversations? So A, sort of what are their own emotional reactions? What are their own barriers? How do they take care of themselves to be prepared to have these conversations? What barriers do they have? And then we give them sort of challenges specifically to those barriers. Like, even though this is hard, this is why it's important. Or yes, your kids are young, but your kids are gonna, you get to control this conversation. You can't control what happens to them outside in this world. We can't control racism and discrimination, but you can control how your kids perceive the world, how they interact in the world. That's where you do have control. So the ready is, and then really, what messages do you want to give? What are the things you want to say to your kids? How do you want to say it? One thing we struggled with, right, is who am I to tell anyone what skills they should give their kids? So really it was more like, what do you want? What's important to you? What aligns to you? Because I don't think the research is in a place where we can say, this is exactly what you should say to your kids and this will help them. But it was more like, what do you value? What messages do you want your kids to get and how to have those? So that's the ready part. The set is setting these conversations to your kids, setting them to their different aspects of themselves that sort of interface with experiences of oppression, sort of their gender, their body build. Do they speak with an accent? Are they an immigrant? Are they documented or not? Their sexual orientation, just other things, sort of phenotype, skin tone, all of these things that may influence how people perceive them and how people understand them and their experiences of discrimination within that context. Setting it to the context that you live in, right? Is your kid the only minority kid in that school setting? Or are they a member of a, lots of different minority kids, but that's not their own group, right? So really, what is the context of their peers, their school environment, their after-school activities, and how do you set the conversations to that? And then finally, setting it to your kid's personality, right? So some kids need to just have a quick conversation. Some kids want to have a more in-depth conversation. Some kids, maybe are more dysregulated or get more angry. So that conversation might look different than a kid who sort of blows you off. One of the girls in the study just did not want to talk to her dad about it. And so she was just not into it at all. So just that it might not seem easy, right? That a lot of parents say, well, they're just ignoring me. Well, that's okay. It's still important to have these conversations. And finally, the talk portion is just basic parent-child communication kinds of stuff, so active listening, open-ended questions. We also talk about that a lot of parents say, well, I took my kid to this activity. I took them to the African American Museum and then we left, but maybe they didn't have a conversation about it. So we talk about what are conversation builders you can have if you watched a movie or if you read a book or if you did something to really sort of gain from that experience as a family to sort of help them understand that. So those are the parts that we sort of focus on. And then parents sort of fill out things personalizing these to their own family, right? What are their specific barriers? What are their specific characteristics for their kids? What kind of messages do they want to give more on? What kinds of things do they want to focus on? So that's in this middle component. And then the final piece is modeling. So we have different families. We have 2 sets of families for each having these conversations where they can see what these conversations look like. You saw an example of one when we started, but these are the different pieces that we have. And what was so interesting is when we had kids talk with their parents, they brought up stuff their parents hadn't heard of that had happened to them when we made, just even making the videos was an intervention in of itself for some of these families. And then we have parents go through and say, well, what did that mom or dad show in terms of ready, set, talk? How were they ready? What messages did they give? How did they set it to their kids' expectations and experiences, and how did they talk? And then we sort of round out the video at the end, sort of talking around sort of, okay, now that you've gone through this, where are you going for? What kinds of conversations do you want to have? How do you feel? What are some barriers that you have, and how can we help you overcome them? And then we also give them a lot of handouts. So we have little handouts that we have with the conversations. We have little role plays that they can do. So what would you say to your kid if this happens? So we have a little role play scenarios that they can talk about. We talk about reactive sort of conversations if your kid brings up something versus proactive conversations, so you starting those conversations and what that looks like. And then based on some of our feedback when we started piloting the intervention, a lot of them wanted to know, well, what can I do at different age ranges? So we gave them some feedback on that, like what are the kinds of things to talk about in these particular contexts. Then we also went and combed the literature to find just resources that they can have. So we have these resources. Here are some books you can do, TV shows you can watch together, movies. We even put podcasts on there if you want to watch podcasts with your kids. So it's sort of, again, to facilitate these conversations that they are having. So I think so I'm going to skip this one because this one was already there. So what we found with our study thus far, so we've piloted with 12 families, and the 12 families resoundingly have said this was really important, that it changed how they were having conversations with their kids, that they really felt that this was something really useful. All of them reported increases in the efficacy of having these conversations, particularly the prep for bias conversations, which is what our target was. But we did also see increases in efficacy for the cultural socialization conversations as well. And so what our ultimate goal is to leave kids.
Yo aprendí que no tener miedo y si yo tengo derechos, ser feliz porque yo tengo dos culturas, soy latino and americano.
So our goal is, again, to leave kids feeling prepared to live to sort of face the environment that they are interested in. We don't have a lot of good data from the kids yet, so that's what we're hoping to do. So as I said, we've actually made this live. It's free. People can go access it. They can do whatever they want with it. And what we notice that the folks that are actually accessing the website and trying to use it are community folks that say, oh, I want to use this I work in the community and I want to use this. So we're now going to develop a community version of it. And so we're going to apply for some funds, to test this intervention in a larger study, but also to develop one that you can sort of print out all of these, and so then you don't have to do it all online, and so that you can have it in a community-led kind of way. And we're doing some of that with some of our community partners now. So I have a partnership with a YWCA that services the Latino community, and we're going to try to do it that way. One thing that we did learn in our focus groups is the family said, we do want to learn how to do this, we just don't know how. So when does discrimination hurt? So discrimination hurts across time. We saw from what I sort of talked about that it depends on when it sort of happens, and that we really need to do more work with a life course perspective that really thinks about timing issues, I think is really important. When discrimination hurts, we don't know yet what protects kids from those experiences when they have in terms of mental health symptoms, right? These are really hard experiences for them, and they lead to negative mental health symptoms. So it's important for us to continue to do work really specifying the different types of symptoms, depression, anxiety, acting out, risky behaviors, that we really need to do more work. And when discrimination hurts, we need to help parents have conversations to help prepare them for having those kinds of experiences to sort of live a happy and healthy way. So that is all that I have for you today. I want to thank a host of collaborators that this work could not have been done without them. Just a lot of people that have sort of inspired me and mentored me throughout my career, postdocs and all of my graduate students, and of course the families and school districts where we've done all of this work. So I want to thank you, and now I open it up for questions.
Like all the stuff is so cool and very powerful. So, is it on? Okay. Okay. So my question was for the earlier portion, like when looking at the results from your study on like the coping strategies and how it works together with the ethnic racial identity. So it seems like, I don't know if I'm reading the results correctly, but it seems like for kids who have strong ethnic racial identity, discrimination is associated with greater depressive symptoms. and it's only associated with with discrimination was only associated with less depressive symptoms when they have higher coping, like the shifting and yeah. So what do you think of that? What is the implication of that finding?
No, we did think a lot about that because we're like, we don't want people to take away saying that you should have low levels of racial ethnic identity and that's protective. So that was not what we think. We think that partly, so really that this is a process of kids are making meaning in their environment, right? And that they don't perceive that sort of to be central to their identity. So those experiences aren't sort of viewed as a racialized stressor. They're not internalizing it about them. And one of the things but I think it's important to note that majority of our kids are not those kids. In our sample, we have our private regards at 4.5 on a 5-point scale. So, and for centrality, I think it's like 4.3 or something. So those are not sort of kids that have, so that's not the majority of children, right? So most kids feel connected to their racial group, as they should, feel connected to who they are, that feel like it's part of who they are. So the question for me comes to say, well, for those kids who don't view it that way, it's clear that discrimination would be less impactful with shift and persist, right? Because they're able to sort of just say, well, this doesn't pertain to me. This isn't about anything central to who I am. But most kids aren't those kids. And so what it really leaves the question to me is like, what do we give the kids that do have that, the majority of kids who have those high levels of ethnic racial identity, what protection do we give to them? So I agree that when I saw that, but then I sat back and said, well, it makes sense in the context that we know that private regard and centrality is a risk, exacerbates the experience of discrimination to mental health outcomes. Your work elegantly showed that in a meta-analytic way. So it really was something that we really think about what else is needed. This is the question I've been asking for the last 5 or 6 years, and I'm still looking for that. So I'm hoping civic engagement and religiosity does something for us. I also do think with the Latinx community, the familism values might be protective as well, in terms particularly the sense of meaning and purpose, and contributing to your family might be really important as well. But thank you, that's a great question. So it did work for economic stress, and in the other sample that we did, it actually does have a main effect as well for economic stress. So so I do think there is something useful for uncontrollable stressors to be able to sort of move into something you find meaning in, to be able to say, okay, well, this happened to me, but I find meaning and purpose in this part in my life. And in some ways, I actually think the Black church has functioned as a shift and persist kind of place in some of the research, sort of in that kind of same way of like a place of hope and meaning and sort of positivity. So I just feel that discrimination is bad. Like I always come back to, like, it's going to take a lot to be able to overcome that. And part of it is sort of how much do we change the kids as much as the environment in which we live in, right? So when we were making our videos for the One Talk at a Time, the filmmakers, who were awesome, by the way, if anyone ever needs any story mine, they did an awesome job. But there are 2 white women who were filming us. One of them was bilingual, and she's like, "Well, what are you going to make one of these for white kids? Like, where's my video? I want a video." And but in some ways that's right. Like, we need to change the narrative for like what's happened, who's posing the risk for kids to feel discriminated against, who's saying those kinds of things. So I think part of it is both and, that we need to also move to have these bigger conversations with kids who are experiencing the privilege. I think that shift and persist, at least the research is showing that it is somewhat protective. It just, for racialized stress, I think it's just a really hard stressor. We were just talking earlier that we just don't even have really good measures of how to cope with racialized stress. So I think it's there's still a lot that we don't know. So one of the things that we're toying around with is actually asking shift and persist for discrimination. And does that matter? So just even all we're doing, it's not even that, we just added, when you're discriminated against, do you look for meaning or purpose, do this, do that. So we're trying to see, like, potentially shift and persist for discrimination is a different skill set than shift and persist more broadly. So anyway, But those are valid.
I study some families that have children with disabilities, and so there's also this shift and persist, right?
Yeah.
Because there's discrimination, and there's a lot of we'll make meaning out of this, thing that happened, and maybe not so good. And so then I'm like, I wonder, looking at your results, I wonder if that also makes folks inactive. Was one of the things that came across is say like, well, there's a purpose in this, so we'll just be content where we are, whether that then makes you not be an agent of change. Yeah.
No, that's why I feel like the persist piece is really important. I think okay. Oh, but I guess there's still potentially people here. Maybe I'll let them see me now. The persist thing, I think, I think for it to be working, there is an active piece, right? So when you think about primary and secondary coping, right? Primary coping is I'm going to enact something on the specific stressor that I'm experiencing to change it, right? I'm going to study harder for my tests. I'm going to, go talk to the friend who called me about, whatever. I'm going to go do something. And I believe with shift and persist saying like there's secondary coping, and I think the primary coping piece isn't to that specific person or stressor, but to another kind of larger social justice kind of perspective, or another way in which you can see that you can connect with other people and find meaning. So you're doing active things, you're just not doing active things to change the immediate stressor that you're experiencing in that moment. I don't know if that so I think that there's a bit of it that even though it's secondary coping, I think it's secondary coping to switch to do the active thing in the persist parts and the things that are going to give you meaning, that are going to give you a sense of hope for the future, that's going to make you feel that I can impact the world in some other kind of way. And I think that's where I'm really curious. So there's some really good work at NC State that's being done by Ilan Hope on civic engagement. Some other folks are doing this work, and I'm really curious to see. And we're collecting data right now with some college students on this. So I'm curious to see, like, does the persist have to look different for kids of color, and what does that persist look like? And I do think there's something active about it. I agree with you. I don't think it's just like, oh, well, like the world happened to me, because I don't think that would be protective, particularly for depression and anxiety.
Well, I was wondering whether that's why your results weren't quite as strong as
Yeah.
you would have anticipated, because there could be a little bit of that mixed into it.
Yeah.
And if you could get the tangential, like I actively promote to make my environment
Yeah.
more inclusive.
Yeah.
Whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
And because of that, I know that this happened for a reason, or I was
Yeah.
these things for a reason.
Yeah.
That might be different.
Yeah. You were going to say something.
Well, so one issue is that there's a particular kind of climate and context for these violence in your more recent studies. And so it's not just even kind of daily racial stress and the anticipation of that happening. It is intensified in another way. So this is something that is right now in your face. It's not something that you respond to over time.
Yeah.
There's something else that generated it. It's a set of policies. There's something real. There's people you know who are experiencing this at an intense level. Whereas the women in their own families, they have experienced some things like right now. So it has always felt to me as though racial stress was its own kind of very special stressor that is even different from other kinds of horrible, difficult stressors, and therefore the skills, the coping skills that are needed and the supports that are needed are also extremely unique. And that's partially emerging in your data. But I also wonder if the immediacy of the context is also changing how or making the S&P irrelevant in this moment. That's one question I have for you.
Oh, yeah. Yes, because it's like, how do you cope with these kinds of things? And if you look at that, I mean, what I love about that conversation is the mom really sort of focused on, you still have family, they can't separate us, so it really had a lot of sort of SMP kind of things of sort of like, I want you to be happy, I don't want you to worry about this, we have a plan, it's going to be okay. So I think that there is some way in which the mom herself was sort of showing those kinds of processes to sort of saying, focus on what you have people have your back, right? And so that social support, I think, is really important, and those networks are really important. And I do think that this uncertainty, right? This fear really is coming out of this uncertainty in this time right now. And so I think as much as you can put some control so I do feel like there has to feel like there's some control that you have over something that is important to sort of give kids and families that kind of experience. I do think that racialized stress is unique, and when I think about one question I've been sort of wondering is what is racialized stress? Like, any stress could be racialized, right? If you think I lost my home, well, you could have lost your home for lots of reasons, but if I lost my home because I am X, right? And so I think that additional because I am, right, because of this aspect of my identity adds to that stressor feeling personal. So I think one of the things that we still need to understand is how the experience, I know Adam, I think, is trying to do some of this work, is how physiologically is just even the same stress that's viewed through a lens of race or any social identity, sort of, ability, status, or any social identity.
Whether it's the stress related to any identity, right, any discrimination with any identity, or is racial ethnic a particular kind of
Yeah.
category of that may be as bad as that can be.
Yeah.
Maybe above, maybe because you have access, if you have access to other more mainstream identities
Yeah.
while you're dealing with
Yeah.
this particular identity, maybe that attenuates some of the intensity of it.
Yeah.
Although, I don't want to say that in a very strong way, because discrimination is painful no matter where.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's sort of one part. Another question I had was about sort of building a coping skill.
Mhm.
And one of the ways that we looked at families sort of working through scenarios, so I love the way you gave open-ended. We did some open-ended stuff like work this scenario out together, and then we step out of the room. But we gave them a racialized scenario, and then we asked the parent and the child to solve that scenario. And in those cases, we found that the parents did a lot of scaffolding of the child's experience. So they would give the child the opportunity to kind of give ideas about how to solve the problem. And then if they disagreed with the child, and they had fairly good parenting skills, that was important, that they would, and they didn't like, they thought where the kid was headed might be wrong. They didn't say, no, you're wrong.
Yeah.
They kind of said, well, that's interesting. What about this? Or have you thought about that? Or isn't this more protective? And then they keep having that conversation until they build the child to a whole range of strategies. Are you sorry?
Yeah, so we haven't done it as elegantly as you described. So, but I do think that's a really I think part of what we were focused on the one talk at a time is that I think sometimes even it's called like the talk, right? It's just like as if there's only one talk that exists that you have one time and then it's done. And those like continual experiences of coming back and negotiating things differently. One thing that was interesting is because we just observed these families who were doing these videos, was we did see that where parents sort of disagreed with how their kids sort of went about coping. So one of the kids, for example, was like, well, they say those things about me, but I'm special because I speak 2 languages. And the mom's like, you're not better than anyone. Everyone's the same. She's like, don't be like, so it was like, she had like found this like resilience, and then mom's like, no, we're all the same. You shouldn't feel better than, right? So she was very explicit in saying, like, shutting that down. Well, the other dad was not. The other dad, the kid was said this like very sort of in his peer group had these like, because I think the other piece is that, and we did see this in our focus group, is that navigating awkward kids, right? So kids are like, this discrimination is mostly from their peers, some from their teachers and other folks, but for the most part, we know that kids mostly experience discrimination from their peers or things that kids are saying to them, particularly as they're younger, right? So they're saying these kinds of things. And so then parents, I think, also are struggling, like, that's just like a bad peer. So one of the things we found in our focus groups is like, well, is that discrimination, or is that bullying, or what is that? What do we what do we even call it, and how do we even sort of address it, particularly in the immigrant groups? So I think that was the other piece in which they sort of focused a lot on, if it's a peer, then they go in at it as like a peer bullying kind of thing, as opposed to like, well, what does that then mean for your identity or feeling connected in your group? So I don't. That doesn't completely answer. So I think there is some of that. I don't think we have a lot of data to answer about the scaffolding, but I do think that one thing we saw is sort of that parents. I think the good parenting matters, and sort of being able to sort of think through their kid and being child directed, and the more top-down approaches were not as effective, at least from what the focus group data was telling us. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll start with the easier question, which is the measure of identity, and then move to the more challenging question. So the identity that we've used, so we've tried both the MIME and the MIBI. And so the MIBI has sort of private regard and centrality, and we found that those tend to hang together in our samples. So we use those together as opposed to separately. And then public regard does do some other stuff. So we didn't include public regard here. So in the study for ours, we had we just used the private regard items that were sort of modified to use across different racial ethnic groups that Lisa Kyung had done with her work with Andrew Fellini. So we use those modified MIBI items. There's research to sort of think around like what does private regard and centrality mean versus exploration and commitment, and those are different processes and sort of different approaches to understanding ethnic racial identity. We focused more on those content pieces, and you're right that I think it'd be interesting to look at what does shift and persist look like in combination, for example, with commitment, which is sort of that idea that you've like searched your identity and now you feel connected to that identity after sort of some of that process. I guess we could do that. So something potentially we can look into. The Latinx question is one that, as anyone who does this research in the last 5 years is sort of battling with. So I think one thing I tell I personally identify as a Latina, right? So I don't identify as Latinx myself. I identify as Latina because that intersectional sort of identity piece is an important part to my identity. But I do feel like, yes, the community, we had sort of the question of how do we then interface with the community using this term. So like the college students are all using Latinx. So all the younger folks use that term, while the older folks don't use that term. So we've been sort of going with back and forth. So I've started just saying them all and then saying like, I'm inclusive to all our terms. And I think for me, why I've embraced the term Latinx, I do feel like the gendered hierarchy that exists in the language, as well as sort of just giving space for folks that are in marginalized communities to have a space to feel that they don't have to be in that binary. So I've embraced it as a way to sort of be an ally, and so I publish with it in that kind of way. Not that I've ever, so I think it's, some people sort of argue like, well, do you ask them how they identify and then you use all those identities? I mean, it's so difficult to do this work, right? It's so difficult to even find out, like kids identify, they change their minds, they like one data point to the next data point, they use different terms. So I do think like at some point as a scientist, you say, okay, this is the term I'm going to adopt as this umbrella term for this group, acknowledging that people within this sample may use different terms to sort of identify themselves, is how I've come to resolve it. But I will say in some of even when we were advertising one talk at a time, I think we still say Latina, Latino, just because we know that for a lot of folks, that's going to be they're like Latinx, they're like, they wouldn't even like identify, it would be like already too removed. So I think that's where the harder piece is when you intersect. I think academically it's easier, but then when you intersect with the community, it's a little bit more challenging. Yeah, but that's how I've adopted. But I also, when I publish with my students, I also don't want to impose how I want to define the population on them. So some of my work now, so actually my students have all moved. I've convinced them all to move to the Latinx, except one student who still wants to use Latina, Latino. And I said, okay, well I don't want to sort of impose my view on how I think you should use this term. Particularly, it's interesting, I got, from a reviewer I got back, as a Mexican American, I think this term is not appropriate. And I was like, well, as a Mexican American, I think this term is, But like, what if I hadn't been Mexican American, right? Like, who's to say who can name this term and who owns it? And like, what if I had been a researcher who didn't identify in the Latinx community or the Latino community? Then am I less allowed to, you know? So I think it's an interesting conundrum. Although I think most folks academically are moving that way. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Oh, sure.
So early in the presentation, in the transition from what was it, middle school to high school, that in the year of the transition you didn't see the anxiety, but in the following year you see the anxiety. So what is that? What's happening? Are they just excited the first year and then reality sets in, or what's
Yeah, so the finding, and it's a little, so it wasn't that so it was if you reported, so your symptomatology at 12th grade, so when you finished high school, if you experienced increases in discrimination post those two different transition points, that uniquely predicted your symptoms at the end of, so it wasn't that you were experiencing more anxiety in that. I mean, they might have been as well. We didn't test that particular question. So what I really think is that it's sort of creating, I think sort of that work, just sort of thinking around the developmental cascades that are happening at that time, in terms of like, so are you then anxious in peer groups? You're worried. You're not sort of spending time with your peers. That raises sort of your anxiety. You avoid your peer groups, and we know with anxiety, the more you avoid, the more anxious you become. So then it sort of, I think, feeds into itself. So I think when you experience this new context and then don't feel comfortable because of your race and ethnicity in that context, that makes it harder for you to connect with your peers. And I think that's what's leading to those symptoms. And I think it's anxiety in particular because of this sort of developmental cascades across models. A lot of the work with discrimination and depression really finds that it's a concurrent kind of relationship a lot of times. So it's sort of like I'm feeling discriminated against and that's making me feel really badly. And there's some longitudinal effects. So I do think it's interesting to think about, like, is depression more proximal? And then that leads to some distal outcomes, like through the cascades to anxiety symptoms. I have a student who's looking at, one of the things I'm also interested in understanding is how academic achievement and discrimination and depression all sort of go together. So I have a student whose dissertation is going to be looking at some cascade models within that, sort of to think around how do these all sort of fit together across time. So I think more work needs to look at it that way, which in the discrimination literature, we don't have a lot of those cascades kind of models that we see in other literature around sort of thinking around sort of how different experiences impact other aspects of the self and move forward in time. So I think that's an open question. Do you have ideas?